When did you realize the person you were dating had absolutely no brain cells? We had just moved in together, and I made dinner every night. One night, I went to a slightly later workout class than usual, and when I came home, I realized he had made dinner just for himself, steak-tipped salad, ate it all, and packed up the leftovers for his lunch the next day. I was upset. He said he understood why I was upset and promised to handle dinner for the two of us the very next night. The next night, I came home from yoga, and he was already tearing into some takeout. Why he hadn't waited for me to start eating, we'll never know. I asked what he'd ordered for me. He said, and I quote, broccoli. I thought he was joking, but he clarified that I could have some of the broccoli that came with his chicken lo mein. He hadn't actually ordered me anything because, according to him, I don't like Chinese since I'm a vegetarian. Story 2. When we were driving back after a date, he told me he wasn't getting the vaccine because of microchips, and it was predicted in the Bible. I laughed, thinking he was joking about those conspiracy nut jobs. He was not. We had been dating for about 3 months, and religion had never even come up. When I realized he was serious, I said, "The Bible is fiction, but even if it wasn't," and went on to explain what the Bible actually says. He later broke up with me because I'm not a Christian. I was salty that he beat me to it. Story 3. When they washed dishes, they wouldn't rinse all the soap off, because apparently since soap kills germs, it's fine to ingest a little. He also didn't believe me when I said you shouldn't use leftover antibiotics from prior prescriptions to treat a cold. And he wouldn't wear earplugs at clubs or concerts because, according to him, he couldn't hear the music as well when he was right by the speaker. We didn't last long at all. Edit. I didn't realize this could potentially be a cultural thing with dish soap, but I don't think it was in his case. His reasoning genuinely was, if it kills germs, it's good for you. Story 4. I took a nap and asked her to cook dinner, corned beef. I even explained the steps. The package had instructions. Add seasonings to water, bring to a boil, add the meat, reduce to a simmer for a couple of hours. Simple, right? When I woke up, she hadn't reduced the heat or refilled the water. The corned beef had been boiling on high for over 2 hours. I ran to the kitchen and found the most disgusting dried out husk of meat I've ever seen. She hated cooking that one day a week I needed rest. And if I mentioned she couldn't cook, suddenly I would be the a-hole. She's an ex now. Seriously, boil water, turn down the heat, wait 2 hours. How is that confusing? Who thinks leaving half a pot of water boiling for 2 hours is normal? Story 5. My beloved budgie, the one I helped learn to fly and say a couple of words, would land on my hand when I snapped my fingers. One day, he wasn't feeling well and passed away in my hands. I bawled my eyes out while scrubbing his cage and decorating the Christmas card box where I buried him. My then boyfriend thought he could cheer me up by putting on comedy clips. Less than an hour after my bird died, he put on the Monty Python dead parrot sketch. My budgie was smarter than that idiot. He also liked to brag about being a black belt, never saying in what, and he couldn't even do basic stances. He'd argue with people that they were doing it wrong, despite them having videos of their grading and earning their belts. When I asked him to show me a technique so I could see if I wanted to take classes, he got mad and accused me of taking their side. Even his own mother admitted he never actually took classes. He also claimed he'd been invited to join Mensa. This is the same guy who failed a college course twice. And I found a template for an invitation letter in his search history. So yeah, I think it was the dead parrot sketch that truly made me realize this D-head was an idiot. Story 6. I briefly dated a girl who was way into ghosts and the occult. We met online, and it was even on her dating profile, but I assumed it was a lightweight thing, like enjoying scary ghost movies or going all out for Halloween, which is fine. We saw each other 6 or 7 times and spent the night at each other's places a few times. Everything seemed great. Then she invited me to join her for breakfast with a group that met once a month at a diner. I said sure, assuming it would be casual and fun. That's when I learned the ghost and occult thing wasn't an aesthetic or entertainment choice at all. There's a subculture where haunted house stories are a gateway into full-on conspiracy territory. QAnon, Flat Earth, the works. I didn't know this at the time, but having spent a lot of time arguing with creationists and similar types, it felt eerily familiar. Within 2 minutes at the table, it was abundantly clear. It wasn't about proving ghosts exist, it was about proving the man was covering it up. I tried to stay polite, but when pressed, I explained, skepticism is great, but the instant you plant doubt, you're left with an entirely different story to explain a phenomenon for which you have no direct evidence. Evidence that a weird radio noise is strange is not evidence that it's Sally, the 12-year-old girl who died in 1887, calling from beyond the grave. Of course, they shut the conversation down with thought-terminating cliches, called me an atheist, as if that were an insult, and labeled me close-minded. I calmly replied that I was only being as close-minded about their ideas as they were about the official story. Deaf ears all around. On the drive home, the girl I was seeing accused me of being an asshole to her friends, saying that if we wanted to stay together, I'd have to get along with them. I said, yeah, that's not a hard choice. Drove home, wrote a quick official breakup text, blocked her, and moved on with my life. I reflected for weeks afterward on how easily people can convince themselves of an entire alternate reality without ever questioning their sources or logic. A lesson in human credulity I won't forget anytime soon. Story 7. We were just 18. She told me that before dating me, she and her girlfriends thought it was perfectly fine to let guys buy them drinks all night, then feel pleased with themselves as they ignored the guy when leaving the nightclub. Not uncommon, I suppose. I pointed out that she was lucky those men were mild-mannered and didn't take issue or follow her and her friends home, turning a small problem, created by her, into a potential stalking situation. That had never even occurred to her. Total lack of consideration and common sense. And yes, that alone should have been a red flag prompting me to dump her, which I eventually did, though at the time, I didn't fully appreciate the pattern I was seeing. In 2016, I dated someone in her 30s who spent a lot of energy cultivating a reputation as a smart girl boss type. Later, she hinted at the bullshittery by self-proclaiming herself to be an alpha. Yes, in the alpha-beta sense. She got upset one day that I didn't buy into the anti-Hillary Clinton stuff she and her dad were obsessed with. She claimed to have done research, and finally showed me a YouTube video that wildly connected random dots and jumped to every damning conclusion possible about Hillary Clinton and the emails. Then she said something like, "See, this one? I don't know what else you would need to know that she's guilty." In disbelief, I just looked at her, then at the video on the laptop, as the illusion of her completely shattered in my head. I gave her the benefit of the doubt that there might be effort I wasn't privy to behind her conclusions, but a lot of it, and the majority of respect I had for both of them, walked right out the door after that. At that moment, I realized that confidence and intelligence are not inherently linked, and that being articulate and assertive doesn't mean someone actually understands the subject matter. It was a stark lesson in separating style from substance, and in recognizing that people can convincingly present nonsense as fact if you don't challenge it critically. I realized that their dinner table commentary wasn't a shallow or brash summary of otherwise deep, intelligent, well-thought-out research. That was the research. The dinner table basing was the thinking and concluding. That's where she got her information from her dad. There wasn't some deeper email chain with references or sources. The socializing and talking was the source. The best way I can describe her personality is this. Imagine giving a confident 14-year-old daddy's girl 2 extra decades of memories to reference, but disconnecting the part of her brain that could process that experience to update her worldview and personality. That's what you would get. An extremely confident 14-year-old with a good vocabulary, inside a woman in her 30s, who nonetheless made decisions and held opinions with zero grounding in reality, evidence, or critical thinking. The reality of confident people being empty-headed completely blew my mind. I couldn't believe I had been living my life all that time thinking there had to be some credibility behind everyone's confidence, just because I kept my own confidence in reserve without having it back up my words and ideas. It's my least favorite realization about society and the world. To be clear, I knew this was a thing for children and teenagers, but I had assumed that adults would largely have grown past it, through facing the embarrassment of being called out and proven. Wrong. Being confident about something without a clear line of reasoning or legitimate backing. Since that's how I developed my own approach, I now often approach confident people with a mix of skepticism and caution, trying to separate genuine expertise from empty bravado. It's exhausting, but necessary. Story 8. An ex of mine used to eat grape nut flakes every morning. That is not when I realized he was an idiot. Grape nut flakes changed the configuration of their box so it didn't fit in the kitchen cabinet he always kept it in. I know, the horror. When I got home from work, he showed me the letter, an actual snail mail letter he was sending to the company to protest their horrible decision. When he saw my expression, "Dude, what the hell?" he asked, all huffy, "What would you have done? Take the bag of cereal out of the box, pour the cereal into a different container, move the cereal to another cabinet, move the cereal to the counter." Sadly, this was not even the first sign he wasn't the brightest light on the tree. He once forgot my middle name, the name I go by and have always gone by. The absolute worst part? He was a tenured professor. Story 9. I was hiking with my now ex-husband and his mom in a local park. He had a piece of 1/2-inch rebar like the kind they put inside cement as his walking stick because his wooden one had broken, and he overcorrected. We were about to step off a sidewalk onto the trail when a park cop stopped us. He asked what we were doing, which was fine. Then he nodded at the walking stick and asked, "Is that applicable here?" My ex looked at his mom and I looked at them, wondering why they weren't responding. After a second or two, they both said, "What does applicable mean?" It means, does it apply? So, was it necessary for the stick to be metal? I ended up explaining. They answered, and we went on our way. On that hike, and for years afterward, they would laugh at the cop and say, he had a word of the day calendar and needed to use the word. Story 10. We got into an argument over what the word safe actually means. She was asking for tips on bleaching her hair, and I recommended hydrogen peroxide. She objected, insisting she wanted something safe. I told her I'd done it myself using the stuff in the brown bottle, entirely by accident, but it worked, turning my hair from brown to sandy blonde, and I wasn't harmed because the bottle was 98% water. She got insulted and said, "I know that," but insisted hydrogen peroxide strips the color from your hair. To her, it sounded like the peroxide would somehow ambush her hair in a back alley and rob it of its color at gunpoint. I still have no idea where she got that idea, but she was adamant about wanting something natural. What actually happens is that it provides hydrogen ions to the double bonds in your hair pigments, which alters them so they stop reflecting certain wavelengths of light. Someone then recommended lemon juice and something else as a natural alternative, but that works in exactly the same way. Hydrogen ions acting on double bonds, same chemistry, different source. It doesn't strip color from your hair the way acetone strips paint. It changes the pigment so it reflects light differently. The argument itself was dumb, but it was so profoundly stupid that I just couldn't be bothered with her anymore. If you're the kind of person who's afraid of chemicals without realizing that water is technically a chemical, and you're going to quibble over the word safe based on vibes and misunderstandings I never introduced, I want nothing to do with you. Not as a friend, not as a partner. I don't even want to know we're driving on the same road because your existence actively offends me. Story 11. She eventually outed herself as a racist. We were at a buffet and they'd run out of forks, so she launched into an unhinged rant because a table of French people had been ahead of us in line. That alone was bad enough, but later she had a full meltdown when someone accidentally spilled a tiny drop of wine and streaked her fake tan. Instead of washing it off like a normal person, she insisted on going back to the hotel with 4 of her friends to fix it, then promptly passed out on the bed and ruined the entire evening for everyone. But what really ended it was the extremism. She suddenly became a born-again Christian and started making the most unhinged claims about the Bible, Satan, and morality. I went to seminary school as a kid in Ireland, and it was painfully obvious she hadn't actually read the Bible at all. It was just a shield, something she used to claim forgiveness for the awful things she did while simultaneously justifying her blatant racism toward anyone who wasn't white. She believed everything she saw online, looked down on non-believers, and somehow saw no contradiction in being a functioning alcoholic and a raging hypocrite. Hands down, the stupidest person I've ever dated. Story 12. Oh Lord, there were so many incidents. Some days I wonder if he was just stupid, which he absolutely was, or if he was willfully obtuse so he could emotionally and financially abuse me. Warning, casual racism ahead. The biggest one. I told him that when I was an adult, I'd like to adopt a girl. I didn't specify where from, but he immediately assumed China and said, "Don't adopt from China, she could only eat rice." Like, what? You're from the Midwest and eat rice and Asian foods? What makes you think she couldn't? Another incident, he had a stomach bug and insisted I take care of him because it was just food poisoning. I am deeply, deathly afraid of vomit. I completely lose it around someone who is sick to their stomach. I know it's an unhealthy fear, but it is what it is. He would not let me leave and even took my car keys. Hostage. Naturally, I ended up getting the stomach bug the next day because he neglected to tell me that everyone in his house was also sick. I was vomiting every half hour and couldn't even keep ice chips down. My mom was busy with an event and didn't know I was that sick, so I asked my ex to take me to my doctor, literally, just up the street. He kept refusing because he didn't know how to get there, even though I was giving him directions. I eventually convinced him that if I didn't get fluids, I would keel over dead. Only then did he take me to the doctor. Fortunately, the nurses quickly realized he didn't want to relinquish control over a sick patient. They kicked him out and called my mom to pick me up after giving me fluids and Zofran. Meanwhile, he was whining and crying in the waiting room. because he couldn't figure out how to get home, which was just up the street. Story 13. My husband is far from an idiot, but he occasionally has moments of WTF logic. He'll say something that makes me immediately ask, why would you say that? Because I absolutely need to understand how his brain arrived at whatever observation he made. For example, we live in the county seat of a small city near a major metropolitan area. As a result, there are a lot of affluent people in our town. Doctors, lawyers, executives. We are not affluent ourselves. We live in a generational family home that has been in the family for decades. One day, we were driving to the grocery store, and out of the blue, he said, "Porsche must have really lowered their prices." Immediately, I asked, "Why do you say that?" He replied, "They're all over the place. Seems like every third car is a Porsche." I had to explain, "Dear, their prices are still high. We just live in a town that has a lot of rich people who can afford them." Or the time we drove to New Orleans, and he got very excited when we entered Arkansas. I said, "Arkansas, not Arkansas." He then argued that Arkansas was a totally different state than the one we were in. I had to pull up a map and explain that it was the same state, we just say it completely differently than it's spelled. In his defense, he's not originally from the US, and this was his first time actually in that state. Arkansas had never come up in casual conversation before then. Honestly, these moments can be frustrating, but they're also kind of endearing. They offer a little window into how his mind works. Sometimes a complete mismatch with reality, yet always curious, persistent, and full of his own strange charm. Story 14. We dated for a couple of years. I was absolutely head over heels for him, but things started to break down because of his devotion to woo-woo alternative medicine and his absolute refusal to consider any type of evidence-based treatment. I'm a nurse, so this was especially concerning, particularly when I thought about how easily people could get hurt if they followed his advice. I can overlook it if someone believes in chiropractic or acupuncture or something similar. Although I do think both are largely nonsense, there is some very limited placebo effect benefit, and that's fine. But this guy was obsessed with medieval medicine type practices that have been thoroughly debunked and proven harmful. He genuinely believed that the older something was, the more effective it must be, completely ignoring centuries of medical progress and scientific advancement. I had to remind him that back in those days, people died left, right, and center from simple infections or illnesses that are easily treatable today. Many of the natural remedies of that time were useless at best, dangerous at worst, and in some cases outright deadly. Then he started talking about drinking colloidal silver as if it were a legitimate health tonic, and that was it for me. I was done. I just couldn't look at him the same way after that. It wasn't just a lack of common sense. It was a fundamental disregard for science and logic, and the potential consequences of that recklessness terrified me. At that point, I realized that love wasn't enough to bridge such a massive gap in reasoning and judgment. Story 15. He drove just about 2 hours from the city to my small town, a drive that would take any normal driver 45 to 50 minutes tops. It was late in the evening, closer to midnight, and he drove with only his running lights on in the dark on the highway. Alarmed, I asked, "Wasn't that hard? Wasn't it hard to see the road? Didn't anyone flash their headlights at you?" He said yes to all of these. This grown man could have killed someone. Then he explained that it was his first solo highway drive ever, and that he thought the running lights were just headlights. He also thought turning on the headlights was the same as flashing his high beams. He had been driving for 2 years prior. I gently explained for a good 10 minutes how to use his headlights as best I could. I could see the frustration building in him, but it was clear he genuinely did not understand. In that moment, I realized that patience can only go so far. Mind you, I grew up with only sisters and a single mom with no known father figure other than a grandfather 5 hours away. I basically had to teach myself how to drive. This man had many other really illogical or nonsensical issues during the 1 month I genuinely gave him a chance. I kept wondering how someone could navigate life with such basic misunderstandings of everyday things. But you guys, he was just dumb, and I couldn't take it anymore. I broke up with him, and have since thrown most memory of him out of my mind. I have yet to meet anyone as bad. This one takes the cake, and I work as a nurse. Story 16. When she told me she was a vaccine choicer, what followed was every single debunked anti-vax trope I had argued about online during shelter in place. When I asked her for a peer-reviewed study to support one of her claims, she did her own research and came up with 3 links. Only one was a peer-reviewed study, and it didn't say what she thought it did. I could have accepted her being anti-vax out of ignorance, but we had talked at length about vaccines, medical science, the scientific method, and the motivations behind the people who misled her. She did not budge 1 inch. She also rejected all prescription medication because of Big Pharma, without even understanding the criticism she was using. Story 17. My ex-fiancé asked me if I could help him with rent. I'd already asked if his job's paycheck, combined with his expenses, was sustainable, and he had said yes. He had $21,000 in the bank from his father's life insurance, and as far as I knew, he was all set. Cue me asking what the hell he meant. All $21,000 was gone, and he couldn't tell me where it went. Not only that, he claimed his paycheck wasn't covering all his expenses, so he needed help with rent. I had been going to his apartment once a week to help him clean it, and take care of his cats too. You know what? Maybe I was the idiot. Story 18. I worked for many years as a laser physicist. A relatively new boyfriend once asked where the word laser came from. I told him it was an acronym for light amplification by the stimulated emission of radiation. He didn't believe me. He Googled it and declared Google wrong when it gave him the same answer. I then showed him a pre-internet textbook that said exactly the same thing, and he grudgingly accepted it. He also refused to believe that lasers predated the widespread use of the internet. Once again, he checked Google and immediately declared it wrong because it disagreed with him. That level of stubborn stupidity was too much to bear. Story 19. This was a first and last date. She said she loved reading, so I asked what types of books she liked. She said, bibliographies. I replied, so a book about other books? She said, no, it's a book about someone's life. I also like books people write about their own lives, autobibliographies. Have you really never heard of a bibliography? Followed by an eye roll. It could have been a silly mistake, but I felt I had to say something. She argued with me for about 10 minutes, even after I tried to laugh it off and change the subject. Eventually, I asked her to take out her phone and Google it, which she did. After that, she refused to speak to me for the rest of the meal. We did not stay for dessert. Story 20. I got a letter in my email a few months ago saying I owed $53 in child support and that I needed to call immediately to pay it. It was addressed to first name, middle name, first name. I told my girlfriend to throw it out. Not long after that, I started getting strange identity theft red flags. HR told me someone had opened an unemployment claim in my name. While I was trying to track that down, my girlfriend told me it couldn't be related to the child support letter because she had called the number on it and given them all of my information to clear up the misunderstanding. Story 21. I had an argument with my ex because she was convinced my house used propane, not natural gas. I had lived there for 5 years, and she had moved in about a year before this argument. I printed out the PGE statement, and she insisted they were charging us incorrectly for natural gas because we were supposedly on propane. I asked her to show me where our propane tank was. I had lived there 4 years longer than she had, and had never seen one. Obviously, I had never had it filled either, or I would have known exactly where it was. Story 22. Rather than buying a new light bulb, he decided to test the light fitting with a multimeter to see if it was live. Spoiler alert, it was, and a 40-pence bulb would have saved much of what happened that day. The power tripped, the light fitting exploded, and the multimeter in his hand caught fire. So off I went to buy a new light fitting while he called his electrician friend to fix it. 9 hours later, the light fitting still did not work, and the electrician was working by torchlight. Both of them were wondering why nothing was working. I looked up at them and asked, when you last tripped the fuse box, did you reset it? I laughed my ass off at the look my boyfriend and the electrician gave me as I walked away. They both had the same realization at the same time. I married him anyway, and now have a list titled 100 Ways My Husband Has Tried to Kill Me by Being a Complete Dumbass. It includes fires, floods, putting sharp knives in precarious places, and of course, repeatedly mixing electricity with water. I once asked him what goes through his mind when he is doing things he is definitely not qualified to do. Story 23. We were playing Kings. Cup, and the category was countries. He said Florida. We gave him another shot, and then he said Miami. I asked him how far he thought the drop was from the top to the bottom of Niagara Falls. He said 10 feet. We were standing right in front of the waterfall. He had a homework question that was literally 15 divided by 3. He was a pastry arts major, so the questions were easy, and he immediately started typing it into ChatGPT. I told him to try it himself first, and he said 6. He was 20. The only things he could really talk about were drama or celebrities. Dinners were usually pretty quiet, and whenever I tried to talk about anything beyond him making fun of someone he did not like, he could not keep the conversation going. I took him to a Bernie Sanders rally, and about 10 minutes away from the venue, he asked me who Bernie Sanders was. He had told me he was a political person, by the way. The list goes on, but the worst part was that the day after we split up, he hooked up with the 32-year-old gay mayor of his town who was in a relationship at the time. It took me months to get over this guy. Story 24. He did not understand what earthquakes were. We live in the Pacific Northwest, an earthquake zone. He was born here and had lived here his entire life. We are taught this in school, and he was an adult in 1997 when we were anticipating a catastrophic one. There is no way not to know this unless he intentionally covered his ears and blocked out all the information. He thought tectonic plates do not normally touch and that they somehow crash together spontaneously sometimes, and that is an earthquake. I asked how he thought that worked. How is that possible without a canyon opening up along the fault lines so the plates can back up and get a run at each other? What powers it? Why does it happen? Why does it happen in some places and not others? No answers. Just complete vacancy, followed by annoyance that I was asking probing questions. I did not bother explaining how the literal world works to him. I broke up with him instead. I had already been getting more annoyed and was planning to anyway, but that moment always sticks in my mind as one of the final straws. He thought he was so smart and so superior to everyone, and the dumb fuck still does not know what earthquakes are. Story 25. He first destroyed his vehicle by never checking or maintaining any fluids, despite knowing it had a slow oil leak. He then decided to do his own maintenance on his new vehicle, overfilled it with oil, and did something to the engine that led insurance to declare it totaled. I let him drive my very old car to get to work, and he decided to leave it idling in the parking lot for hours at a time. It overheated, and the cost to fix it was more than the car was worth. He did so many absolutely idiotic things during our 2 years of dating. Story 26. He also claimed to be a history buff and said he had grown up on a farm. Great. I took him to a very famous local historical house. I do not remember all of the strange comments he made, but I will never forget the one that completely broke my brain. As we came up on a couple of smaller vegetable garden plots, he smirked and said, "And what are they growing here?" Then he added, "Weeds?" I just blinked. If he had actually grown up on a farm, this was farming 101. It's being left fallow, I said, assuming that would be the end of it. Nope. He proceeded to ask what fallow meant, how I knew that, and whether I would like him less because he was not as into history as I was, despite previously telling me that he was. I never went on another date with him after that. You can like different things. You can even not know things. Just do not lie about it. Story 27. That moment happened during the trip, so I was stuck with him. First, after buying groceries, he told me I should pay for dinner since he had paid for the groceries, even though I had booked the apartment for us for 3 nights and never asked to split the cost. Later that day, I came down with a fever. While I was shaking in bed, he tried to sleep and did not care at all that I was freezing. He told me I should take a cold shower and acted condescending about it. I barely slept that night, and the next morning I told him I was sick and wanted to go home. He offered to go to the pharmacy to buy me paracetamol and then said, "You can pay me back. No worries," which was honestly ridiculous. While he was gone, I found Vaseline and some creepy, slutty outfits he had apparently bought for me. Luckily, he never even showed them to me. We ended up leaving 1.5 days early from an apartment we had already paid for. The drive home, which should have taken 3 hours, took 4.5 because he was a terrible driver with zero focus on the road. Story 28. When I was 24 and working as a teacher, I dated a 39-year-old man who was still studying at university. He had been there for nearly 14 years without taking any exams. He lived in a student dormitory. Don't get me wrong, I had never been looking for a rich man, and if he had been 25, it would have been totally fine, but he was 39. I still liked him. One day, I had to pick him up in my car. I admit it wasn't the cleanest at the time. There was an empty bottle and 2 letters on the back seat, and the floor was a little dirty from rainy autumn days. He opened the door, saw the mess, and said, "You seem to have lost control of your life." I got up and left him without any explanation. Story 29. My most recent ex wanted to make dinner. She tried to get me to decide for her, but she eventually settled on one of those soup-in-a-bag things. For context, I usually did all the cooking. I left the kitchen to let her handle it while I did other stuff around the house. About 10 minutes. Later, I came back to grab a beer and saw that she had taken out my 8-quart Instant Pot, boiled all 8 quarts of water, and dumped the soup mix in. I looked at it, and it was ridiculously watered down. I checked the instructions and saw her mistake. I asked if she followed the recipe. She said she did, to the letter. The instructions were, boil 8 cups of water, put mix in, boil for 20 minutes, and soup. I asked why she used quarts instead of cups. She denied doing anything wrong and still insisted I followed the instructions exactly. I pointed out that she had used 8 quarts instead of cups. She replied, "I didn't know there was a difference between cups and quarts." She was in her mid-30s. We had measuring cups. We had the internet. I was just completely dumbfounded. Like, The combination of lying and incompetence was unbelievable. Story 30. Out for a walk with Simon, who I'd been seeing for a few weeks, I pointed out a kestrel, perched in a tree above a field gate, and stopped to watch it. Simon immediately started searching the undergrowth. I asked what he was doing. I just wanted to watch the falcon quietly together. He said he was looking for a stone. He found a large piece of broken dry stone wall, hurled it into the field, and told me the kestrel would think the rock was prey and chase it, following its trajectory. My interest in Simple Simon had already been fading, but that level of idiocy sealed the deal. I also silently hoped the rock didn't damage the farmer's mowing equipment. Story 31. When I started dating one of my exes, she stayed overnight for the first time. I had to work the next day and she offered to drive me. It was the middle of winter, with lots of snow. That morning we were in the parking lot of my apartment complex and she was struggling to unlock her car. She suggested the lock must have frozen overnight. I just stood there, repeatedly telling her, just use the remote. But she ignored me and kept fiddling with the key. Story 32. When he left me to go back into the closet and move back in with his violently homophobic parents, I was upset. But leaving me was one thing. I'd been broken up with before. I could have handled that. He could have gone anywhere in the world, done anything, been anyone. I can only hope he realized how stupid that was and made an escape plan fast, but I'll never know. Story 33. He asked me which animal pork comes from. How do you live 39 years and never wonder what you're eating when it's pork? The man lived in a penthouse in one of the most expensive cities in the US, yet he was the single stupidest person I've ever met. I should have gone into real estate. Story 34. Don't judge me too harshly, but I gave 6 years to this idiot. He insisted that UTIs were only sexually transmitted. When I got one from a pool, he accused me of cheating for weeks. He also thought that when women are on their periods, they only bleed at certain times, once or twice a day. He believed women used all those products because they didn't know when the daily bleeding would hit, so he insisted I didn't need to change anything as often as I did. When sex ed came around, he would say, I know all of this, and sleep through the presentation. And even when we had biology class explaining periods, he would argue with the teacher. Story 35. Second or third date. I took her to a UK-themed pub. We were sitting at our table when she excused herself to use the bathroom. She came back 2 minutes later, red-faced and angry. I asked what was wrong. She said, stupid theme restaurants. They put some stupid, funny theme signs on the bathroom doors, and you can't tell which is which. I asked what was written on the doors. She said, they both say, ladies, but one is only spelled with one O-D. I blinked and gently said, ladies. What? She replied, one door says, ladies, and the other says, ladies. She immediately blushed, didn't say a word, and went back to the bathrooms. Story 36. When she started insisting that I watch YouTube videos explaining how the Earth was seeded by aliens and that lizard people are hiding among us, controlling everything. When I said I wasn't interested and asked what proof there was that any of it was true, she pointed me right back to the YouTube videos as the proof. She was an awesome person and fun to be with, but in that moment, I knew for sure there was no future for us. Story 37. It boiled down to no intellectual curiosity, bizarre love bombing, and above all, just being adult. The love bombing was amusing at first, but I started to get weirded out by it. I was too polite to just excuse myself from the relationship and was kind of desperate for a reason to bail. This dumbass threw a birthday party for himself and didn't invite me, despite us being together for 6 months. He was stupid. Enough to invite one of my close friends, though. My friend asked for the party details, location, and time, and there was my perfect excuse to exit. A few months later came a sob story and an offer of a very expensive steak dinner. I accepted, got top-shelf cocktails, and there was no sex. I declined a future relationship despite lots of begging. Last I heard, he knocked up the next woman he met. Story 38. I texted my partner to let him know I was miscarrying, and he texted back saying he couldn't come to the hospital because it would be gross. A couple of weeks later, I broke up with him because I couldn't get that level of disrespect out of my head. He threw a full-blown tantrum at the train station, smacking the floor, screaming, rolling around, refusing to go home. It was so wild, I still can't believe it actually happened. Story 39. They honestly believe that an uncle of theirs had his head completely severed in a traffic accident, but that doctors managed to sew it back on in time. It took a long, drawn-out discussion, during which they got pretty offended that I would question the integrity of their relatives before they started to understand why that might not be medically possible. In their defense, they'd apparently been told this as a child and never questioned it all the way into adulthood. Not so much an absolute idiot, more like deeply ingrained naivety. Story 40. My wife made this post for fun, and we've been loving the answers. My dumbest moment? When I was 26 and told her reindeer aren't real, and my world was shattered. I honestly thought they were mythical Christmas creatures, and that the ones at the zoo were fake, so kids would believe in Santa. Then, a few months ago, I asked if the plant-based chicken wings were boneless. She told me plants don't have bones. I'm a moron, but in whimsical ways. I love her. Story 41. I was with him and a couple of my friends when the conversation turned to Pokemon. He really liked it, and I mentioned it wasn't really my thing. He got super confused. Since we'd played one of the games together, he thought I loved Pokemon. I had to explain that I enjoy participating in his interests, even if they're not my cup of tea. Then he asked why anyone would do that. My friends had to yell at him, "Because she loves you, you idiot." That's when I realized he genuinely had no concept of empathy. I'm not even sure what to call it. He didn't understand that supporting your partner's interests is important. Last I heard, he was teaching his new girlfriend to play Pokemon, so I hope she's smart enough to figure him out sooner than I did. Story 42. An ex of mine came home one day in a shambles and had to tell me what happened to her friend, since I was also looking to buy a new vehicle. I only had a few grand, so I was planning to get a clunker someone was selling on the side of the road. Her friend, with $5,000, thought they'd found the deal of the century. Apparently on eBay, someone was selling a brand new car. This was around 2012, and the listing said something like, 2012 new car 5K will ship. She told me they sent the money to buy it. I immediately started laughing, and she was furious, crying. "What's so funny about that? That's all the money they had? Were they just supposed to pass on it?" I said, "Yeah, it's obviously a scam. On what planet would someone sell a brand new car for $20,000 undervalue on eBay?" Then she said, "Yeah, but what if that happened to you? Would you still be laughing, you asshole?" I said no. But I also would never do something like that because I'm not a moron. You'd think that between the two of them, or at least one of their co-workers, someone would have mentioned that it might be a scam. Nope, not a single person said it was a bad idea. Everyone told them to jump on the opportunity. She got even madder and said, "Because that's all the money they had and they don't have a car, they might need to stay with us. And I'd have to deal with it because I'm apparently the asshole for finding it funny." I said, "Of course not. They won't even be staying one night, since clearly they're terrible with money. We can't afford to support them and cart them around." She doubled down on me being an asshole, and we broke up shortly after. Good riddance. There are other stories of her and her idiot friends getting scammed, but that one was the absolute best. Story 43. My wife lived with a guy before we met. He was always kind of a dipshit, no common sense at all. She went out of town to visit her parents, came home a day early, and found the house surrounded by a SWAT team. This genius had gone to the bar to try and cheat while my wife was gone. He waited until about 3 in the morning for last call and picked up the loudest, nastiest, drunkest woman there. The one even the drunkest, most desperate dudes avoided like the plague. He wasn't being picky. He was just trying to put some stank on his dangle. He brought her back to the house he shared with my wife. She accused him of being a CIA agent, chased him around the front yard, stabbed him in the neck with a pair of gardening shears, and dragged him back inside by his feet. The neighbors saw it, freaked out, and called the cops. Everyone responded, like 10 cop cars and a SWAT vehicle. They roll up, and one of them knocks on the door. He answers. She had a knife to his back and made him answer the door. "We're fine, officer." "Stabbing? What stabbing?" Meanwhile, he's holding a towel to his neck, soaked in blood, and spurting all over the front door. The cop can clearly see her behind him with a giant knife. My wife showed up just as all this was going down. She'd taken an insanely early morning flight, trying to surprise him by being there when he woke up. She had to park way up the block and ended up standing across the street watching the whole scene unfold. The cops somehow got the woman out of the house and loaded this moron into an ambulance. He tried to tell my wife she had broken in through the basement. The house did not have a basement. She dumped him the next day while he was still in the hospital. Story 44. I was dating a stunningly attractive girl, and it was our third date. We went out dancing, and she'd met most of my close friends. She seemed really cool and instantly vibed with all of them. Then, as we were sitting in my car outside the bar about to leave, a female friend recognized my car and came over to say hello. That's when my date said words I'll never forget. She instantly transformed into someone else and barked, "Oh, don't touch the car, you peasant. Go fetch me some grapes." I was shell-shocked and turned to her in the passenger seat saying, "I know her, she's my friend," but she seemed completely unhinged, like she was having a PTSD episode, and started screaming at my friend about how she looked poor and should back away. I knew right then it was over. I could never really date this person again. All I could think was, what the hell is wrong with this person? Who says that to anyone? We went on one more date because I really wanted to understand why she had called my friend a peasant and demanded grapes. She explained that her ex-husband had been stolen by a gold digger, and she thinks that triggered her to snap. Unfortunately, my friend never spoke to me again after that night, even though I tried to explain that I was caught off guard and wasn't part of it. I talked to my date about it and told her it wasn't okay. It hurt my friend's feelings because she didn't think I had her back. I also think it unlocked some deep, suppressed trauma for my date. Long story short, that date made it clear she was a really troubled person, and it was the first sign there were deeper issues that needed to be addressed. Story 45. I had been seeing this guy for a few weeks and was sleeping over at his place. During the night, he started making strange noises, so I turned on the light, and it looked like he was having an epileptic seizure. I called an ambulance, and we went to the hospital, where he came to and stubbornly refused treatment, arguing with the nurses. Back at his place, I asked if he was taking any medication. At the time, he had a 5-year-old daughter part-time, and if it had been her instead of me, she wouldn't have been able to call an ambulance. He told me very seriously, no medication. Anyway, you can't die from that. That was enough for me to stop seeing him. About 2 years later, he had a baby with a new woman. When the baby was 8 months old, he died in his sleep from an epileptic seizure. He was 28. Story 46. The air conditioner in my apartment was broken during a South Texas summer, and he was a transplant from Pennsylvania who did not handle the heat well at all. I tried to convince him to take a cool shower to relieve himself, and we ended up in a full-blown argument because he insisted on taking a hot shower instead. His reasoning? That the apartment would feel cooler afterward, relative to the heat of the hot shower. No matter how I tried to explain that this would only raise his core temperature and make him hotter and sweatier for longer, he refused to budge. He took the hot shower. He was also convinced that throwing a damp towel, rather than a dry one, into the dryer with wet clothes would help them dry faster. Even writing this now, it sounds unreal to me. How can anyone be that dim to reason? Story 47. We got into a whisper argument at a restaurant over whether the decorative flowers next to the wasabi were edible. He swore, if it's on the plate, then it's edible. A restaurant would not put non-edible food on a plate. I explained that the lilies were for decoration only. He ate 2 lilies, told me they tasted terrible, and then the waitress noticed the missing flowers and looked worried. Meanwhile, we saw the sushi chefs laughing through the back doors. We ended up getting a free slice of cheesecake to take home as he started complaining of a stomachache. We got married and have been together for 16 years. He's an idiot in anything that isn't math or science, but I love him. Story 48. It took about a year of dating, breaking up, and getting back together. She was cute and really into me, and I was coming off a rough year of being single in college. There were hints all along the way. Her inability to think something without saying it out loud, asking dumb questions, arguing over things I knew she was completely wrong about but insisting that's not what my mom said. A lot of it was immaturity. She was immature in other ways too. I should have seen through it and ended it sooner because it drove me insane. So many times her mouth would get us into embarrassing situations. After she dumped me, I realized she wasn't that intelligent, and I was better off. Distance clarified everything. What felt charming at first slowly became exhausting, and losing the relationship ended up feeling less like rejection and more like relief. Story 49. Back in the day, I dated a guy who, a few examples. While driving a rental car, he threw his cigarette out the window and it came right back through the open rear window, burning a hole in the back seat. Our dryer stopped working, so he called a repairman who asked if he'd ever cleaned out the lint trap. He didn't even know it existed. He didn't know you had to remove the water reservoir from the dehumidifier. He just assumed it had stopped working because it had done its job. He even failed to graduate with the rest of us at university because he forgot to take a required course. Having said all that, he's an excellent human being and has remained a close friend for life. Story 50. I wasn't even dating her. We'd just said hello once before at a friend's house. I was already amazed by her painting ability. She had genuinely exceptional talent. One sunny day, I was drinking with a friend in a beer garden when she walked in carrying one of her paintings. We were blown away by the detail and by the fact that she was an 11 by anyone's standards. She was almost wearing a beautiful summer dress and had eyes you could swim in. 5 minutes into the conversation, she casually pulled out her phone and showed us a video from Hamster, volume on, without a single care in the world. She explained that her ex had sent it to her while they were dating and asked completely out of the blue whether either of us used the site. She then informed us that it was controlled by Satan, that her last boyfriend was a demon who had convinced her to use it, and that he had also pressured her into starting an OnlyFans account. For the next 15 minutes, she preached about the Bible, explained how anyone who didn't follow it was going to hell, and asked me why I didn't believe in the one true God and whether I might also be a demon. She finished by explaining that if I wanted to sleep with her, I'd have to change my ways and meet her mother first. This was our first real conversation beyond hello and nice to meet you. It went downhill pretty quickly from our point of view. My friend has Pakistani heritage, and he didn't say anything, just kept kicking me under the table and gesturing with his eyes and head to leave. I wanted to run, but couldn't decide if that would be rude. Meanwhile, she continued ranting about morality, the sins of the world, and how everyone she knew had been deceived by demons. She even started talking about her plans for charity work and how she only associated with people pure enough to understand her message. By this point, my friend was almost in tears, trying not to laugh, while I was silently calculating the fastest way to exit without causing a scene. Story 51. She was a U.S. citizen, and I am not. We dated for over 2 years in a long-distance relationship. I would visit her once a month. After all that time, she told me her friends had warned her about me, claiming I was only after the papers. The fact that she let the relationship go on for years without saying, "Hey, I only date Americans, sorry," baffled me. I never saw the relationship as transactional, and her accusation was deeply insulting, making me out to be some kind of fraud. Her words were irredeemable. I predicted that if we married, she would berate me daily, saying, "Hey, the only reason you're here is because of me." Keep in mind, I earned 6 figures back home, lived in a paid-for house, drove a paid-for car, hardly poor. There was no way forward after she said that, so I told her the best way to prove I wasn't after the papers was to break up, to continue past. That point would have meant admitting I wanted them. I told her, "I'm sure you and your citizenship will be happy together." She kept calling, but I stood my ground. 2 years later, I married a wonderful woman, and we're Canadians now. Last I heard, she was still single, probably couldn't keep a man, American or otherwise. Story 52. He was coming to visit me on Valentine's, which was also our anniversary. It was cold, and the roads were a bit slippery. About 10 minutes out of his city, he slid into the car in front of him. From that point on, he insisted it was her fault. She stopped too suddenly. I guess she should have run the red or something. That's how he told anyone who asked what happened to his truck. She stopped too suddenly. I remember being at a holiday gathering when he was telling the story, and his cousin and I exchanged a look behind his back and shook our heads. Having driven with him countless times, I knew he almost certainly wasn't keeping a proper following distance and had a habit of tailing people before slamming on the brakes, even when they'd been slowing for a while. He also used to brag about never having an accident, as if skill could somehow make up for sheer recklessness. Listening to him recount it as if it were someone else's fault, I realized some people can't admit mistakes, no matter how obvious, and some drivers are genuinely oblivious to the danger they put themselves and others in. Story 53. This brings back some memories. Back in the late 1980s, I was a young, testosterone-fueled horn dog in my 20s. I ignored all the red flags. She was simply stunning, physically perfect. The kind of girl who looked amazing in the morning without makeup, had a great figure, knew it, wasn't ashamed to show it, and always dressed to impress. She was playful and affectionate, without being clingy or annoying. Best of all, she was ready and willing anytime, anywhere. She believed the man was in charge and would do anything I asked. I, being an idiot who let the wrong part of my brain do most of the thinking, thought she was perfect. What sent me on a loop was when she bragged about not reading a book or a newspaper since high school. If it wasn't Cosmo, Vogue, or the National Enquirer, she didn't care. She lived entirely for fashion and celebrity gossip. In the same conversation, she claimed that if she wrote a check, the recipient had to wait until she had money in her account to cash it. She worked at a bank. One of the perks there was that they didn't hit employees with NSF charges if a check bounced. She was bouncing several checks a month. The stores she bounced checks at still charged her fees, though. At one point, she had over 30 different store accounts, and more than half of them were frozen. She insisted it was illegal for them to charge her anything, and that she wasn't required to pay them back if they froze her accounts. I tried explaining that none of that worked that way. She refused to believe me, claiming she was being illegally blocked from opening new accounts at other stores. She had no idea what a credit score was or how finances worked at all. I had never met anyone so financially ignorant. I was shocked when I found out how she got her job and how much she made. She slept with the guy interviewing her and genuinely believed this was normal. She was hired as the personal secretary to a VP mainly because of her incredible looks. Serious eye candy. Her fashion sense and taste were top-notch, but she wasn't remotely qualified for the job. Within a week, they realized this and transferred her to a less demanding receptionist position. Somehow, she kept her pay, over $35,000 a year, and this was back in the late 1980s. I assumed it was to keep her quiet about how she was hired. Several months later, her boss, whom she was still seeing a few times a week, was caught doing the same. With other women at the company, he was fired, and there was a lawsuit settled out of court. My then-girlfriend wasn't part of the lawsuit, and she still thought this scumbag did nothing wrong. This all happened almost a year before we started dating. As gorgeous as she was, and as amazing in bed, I just couldn't handle her lack of curiosity or intellect. Meaningful conversation was impossible. I broke up with her using the tired, "it's not you, it's me" line. She eventually got let go when local banks started getting swallowed up in mergers and acquisitions. Last I heard, she'd gotten back with an ex, married, had a bunch of kids, became a stay-at-home mom, and was, by all accounts, fat and happy. I often thought about how her life trajectory proved that being attractive could carry someone far, even without common sense or intelligence. And it reminded me that beauty alone isn't enough to sustain a relationship if you value brains as well as looks. Story 54. Boyfriend and I, both white, were close friends with a married couple who had a toddler son. They were black. Boyfriend worked in a small office where some people thought it was strange that his best friend was a black man. Our friends were expecting their second child, and we were thrilled for them. Boyfriend excitedly mentioned at work that his friend was expecting and that he'd be an honorary uncle. Someone made a quip that completely went over his head. That evening, we stopped by our friend's apartment to see the expectant parents and their toddler. Boyfriend enthusiastically proclaimed, "I'm thrilled that I get to be an Uncle Tom." I was so horrified I couldn't speak. I immediately realized someone had said that to him at work and he had no idea what it meant. The fact that the reference made no sense added another layer of ignorance. We all just sat there for a few moments while he looked confused as to why no one thought it was a cute quip. I shot the wife an apologetic look and said we had to leave immediately. He resisted, and I had to physically pull him out the door. I couldn't even form words in the car. I was furious. I knew that nothing short of him going back to 6th grade and actually studying the book would make him understand. That kid is about 25 now, and I'm pouring a shot of whiskey as I write this just to stop myself from reliving the whole incident. Story 55. He thought the lyrics to Crazy by Seal were, "We're never gonna survive unless we have a little baby." He also thought the lyrics to "I Wear My Sunglasses at Night" were, "Don't mess around with the diet Shasta no." It's actually, "Don't mess around with the guy in shades, oh no." Those were just a couple out of dozens of song lyrics he totally misunderstood. I can forgive misheard lyrics, we all do it, but he'd refuse to believe me even when I showed him the actual words. That stubborn confidence somehow made the misunderstandings even funnier and unforgettable. Story 56. My first ex, who was 28 while I was 18 and a freshman in college, actually believed in Santa Claus. He literally looked up a Santa tracker on Google to try to prove me wrong. I just hung up the FaceTime call, told him I was tired, and spent the rest of the night with some peace and quiet. He also thought that humping me with clothes on could get me pregnant, and he tried to scare me into thinking I was pregnant so he could ask his older sister if I could live with him. Mind you, this was when we had just started dating, and he kissed me the first night we met. I didn't even know how to react. I literally had to explain how condoms and pregnancy actually work. The worst part? He graduated high school in Florida. So that might explain a lot. Story 57. I didn't date her, but I had a massive crush on a girl in college until one day at a party. I was excited because I knew she'd be there. When? She came up to me holding a book on taxidermy and tried to prove that goblins existed. She was dead serious, saying things like, "I knew they just had to be real." I was completely caught off guard and just nodded along so she'd go away. Later, I saw her do the same thing to another guy, pointing and gesturing at pages of taxidermy animals posed to look like fantasy creatures. He face-palmed, started going off on her, and she left the party, never bringing it up again. It was shocking, because I'd never met anyone that uniquely dumb before. I've had conversations with juggalos about government conspiracies, but her whole goblins are real routine was on an entirely different level. Story 58. Not my date, but I work as a software engineer. The company hired a UI UX designer and put her on my project. I was tasked with building a pop-up box that announced a new feature on the website, and the design had 2 buttons, Close and Close Plus, Don't Show This Again. built the feature so that "don't show this again" added a value in local storage in the browser. I mentioned to the designer that she could verify it worked by clearing browser data to bring the pop-up back if needed for testing. She said this workflow would confuse users and sent me an updated design with a third button that would unhide the pop-up forever on the pop-up that was already hidden forever. I tried explaining the problem to her, and her eyes glazed over. A couple of years later, we found out she had been banging the head of the UI/UX department. The two of them got married and quit the company. Story 59. She was incredibly beautiful, so beautiful that others, including members of her own family, did everything for her. On her own, she'd ask for help and then do nothing. And if no help came, she had nothing. She did not know how to do anything on her own beyond putting together an incredible outfit. She had an expensive sports car she could not afford and worked as a receptionist. Before we dated, she had almost exclusively dated company owners and rich men who literally flocked around her. Her understanding of the world was not just wrong, it was an infantile grasp of reality. I knew she wasn't the brightest, but the day she felt safe talking about other women was when I realized how flat-out stupid this moron was compared to me. That killed my interest in her fast. Story 60. They were driving, and I was supposed to tell them where to go. I realized a little too late that we should have turned and said something like, "Oh, we need to go right." Without even braking, they yanked the wheel to the right, sending the car skidding and screeching far too fast for the turn. Somehow, we made it onto the road, but it was a very close call. I realized their brain just couldn't judge risk or make a decision. They heard right, and their body acted on it without regard for physics or their surroundings. From then on, if I noticed, we'd missed a turn. I didn't say anything. I just figured out another place to turn and told them well in advance. Story 61. When he tried to weaponize his half-blindness as an excuse not to clean, claiming he couldn't see the mess or would only do a half-assed job, yet would enthusiastically talk about learning to drive, it drove me insane. It should also be noted that he used to play the "why me" card about his blindness, but it was later revealed that he caused it himself by mismanaging his type 1 diabetes, consistently running his levels high, skipping injections, and then wondering why he had seizures, DKA, nerve pain, and diabetic retinopathy. What infuriated me most was the contradiction: selective helplessness for chores, boundless ambition for thrills. Story 62. One for the UK folks here. I'm 49. My story takes place 20 years ago. I had a girlfriend at the time. We weren't, truth be told, very well suited, but we liked each other enough and had a laugh together. She didn't really care for current affairs, culture, or history, whereas I always have. It was against this backdrop that my story unfolds. I said something along the lines of, "Well, I think he can have an honorary knighthood even though he's Irish." She looked quizzical. "Oh, I thought he was American." My turn to look quizzical. She carried on. "You know, the wrestler with the baldy mullet and the huge mustache, Hulk Hogan." She'd mistaken Terry Wogan for Hulk Hogan. At least, they kind of rhymed. Story 63. My very handsome boyfriend came from a prominent Italian family in our small town, who constantly bragged about their kitchen skills to me, an experienced baker who happens to be Greek. In fairness, their Nona had been a prominent chef in the old country, but to my knowledge, not a single grandchild had picked up the torch or bothered to learn from her in all the years since. Instead, they made her cook at every family function and then strutted around claiming that being Italian means cooking is in our blood. Now, that may be true for many cultures, but not for these people. It would have been fine if they weren't constantly undercutting others and bragging, despite never actually touching a stove. I bit my tongue until one night we were having pie for dessert and ran out of whipped cream. Undaunted, I pulled out the mixer, some heavy whipping cream, a little sugar, and vanilla extract, just like my Greek grandmother had taught me. Within a minute, the entire family had surrounded me, utterly perplexed. "What are you doing?" they asked. Confused, I explained that I was going to make whipped cream from scratch. Cue the next hour of me explaining where whipped cream comes from, and blowing their minds as I transformed the cream from a liquid into a solid. When I asked these grown adults why it was called heavy whipping cream, they just stared at me blankly. I know it may sound silly, but in that moment, I knew definitively that I did not want to join this family. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.